All right. Well, let's get started. All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. This is the GraphQL Hangout, EMEA edition. This is episode number 49. It's been a nice long journey. I am Budha, product evangelist here at Tyk and the co-host for the GraphQL Hangout. Joining me, as usual, here is the one and only Richard. Hey, Richard. Great to have you with me.
As always, good to be here. Thank you for that.
Fantastic. All right. Let us kick things off a little bit. And the discussion, the topic that we're going to be talking about today is a very interesting one. And hopefully we'll get some opinions coming towards us as we move along. And what we're going to be tackling today is going to be the great API debate. We're going to be looking at three API styles, which is REST, GraphQL, and gRPC. And we're going to be looking at, who is the ultimate winner of this competition. TLDR, of course, on this is always, and I think if you have read anything on the internet, TLDR in a lot of cases, especially in debates like this, is it depends. So that's not where we're going to be ending necessarily, but that's going to be something that you might have to consider regardless. Is it really a versus? Is it really something that can work hand in hand? Is there a more harmonious tone to this entire conversation as opposed to something that is a little bit more zero-sum game? So we'll see how that goes. What I'm going to do, the format of today's event, I'm going to be setting the scene a little bit, just give you a bit of an introduction to each one of these different API styles. And then we'll open the floor up for discussion. So definitely jump in at any point of time. You all have an opportunity to speak to us and tell us what you think. Have you tried any of these different API styles? What your experience has been? Are you interested? Are you intrigued by any of these? Or do you absolutely dislike one of the others? So let us know, and we'll be here to talk about it and hear your thoughts and opinions, and hopefully give our opinions and insights into what we feel with some of these things as well. So going right along, we're going to be starting off with REST, which I think most of you should be familiar with, especially if you've delved into the world of APIs. REST is probably the most popular kid in the block at this moment, probably a very mature kid at this point, because it's been around the longest out of the three. And REST stands for Representational State Transfer. And what it really does is really makes data available as resources. And I think while we are talking about this, it's also important to just go back to basics and talk about APIs and what they really do. They're really a mechanism for data exchange and manipulation, really looking at CRUD operations primarily, exchanging of information or interaction or communication between a client server or a server to server. Basically, inter-system communication is what APIs are really meant to enable. And REST is one of the ways in which you can do that, whereby REST essentially makes the data available as resources. And it's like I said, it's the most popular kid out there. It's most commonly used around, so it's been around the longest. It's quite mature. The community around that is quite mature. If you're looking for tool sets, if you're looking for resources around it, you'll probably get a whole lot around this as well. So the pros about this is essentially a mechanism to decouple your client and your server. That's quite important when you're especially thinking about an API first product today. I think really looking at decoupled ways in which no single points of failures. You're essentially looking at that from that perspective. Also, we've got support from multiple formats here, although JSON is probably one of the most common formats that is used today, widely used formats when it comes to REST today. But there are other formats like XML that is also used with REST, which can be used with REST as well. So it is a little bit more flexible when it comes to the way the kind of formats that it supports. Equally, it also is flexible in the way it works. It's a lot easier to get started. It's a lot easier to get up and running with. It's probably the easiest one to maintain over a period of time as well, and maintain and manage over a period of time as well. It's probably got the highest amount of documented tools and standards and guides around it. However, the challenge that comes with it is that while there are things that try to standardize REST, there is no standard REST structure that goes with it. It's not really predictable when it comes to what you might be expecting, especially as a front-end developer, especially on the client side. What you are expecting as a response is not always as easy and as clear, which it also has the tendency of succumbing to big payloads. So if you go by, the URLs, which is essentially how you work with REST, it has got your standardized HTTP ways of terminologies that you're essentially working with here. You're having CRUD operations that you're essentially working with. But in some cases, if you're looking at, your /users, or you're looking to get a list of items, those items can be really, really big, especially in organizations with a lot of data. So your payloads could be quite big. And I'm not going into the details of, how you can limit that through queries and paginations, a little bit more advanced, but at face value here, we have big payloads to deal with. Then we have as a consequence of some of that is also that it may succumb to over or under fetching, because once again, it's a structure that is essentially determined by a backend developer or backend engineer. And when it comes to actual use cases of, what your application may actually need, maybe it is great for one, but maybe not for some of the other devices that you might also be applying the same APIs to. So, it may give you more information than you might need, or it might give you less information, which requires you to then do multiple HTTP round trips, which may not be desirable. So that's what REST is. I think the thing to note with REST in most cases is that it is quite easy to get it wrong. It's easy to get started, but it's also easy to get wrong, because a lot of times there are specific guidelines that you can follow to be RESTful, and which is kind of what our objective is typically when we are starting off. But in a lot of cases, instead of going RESTful, we end up going REST-ish, which is, again, not a desirable state to be. And you can get into a lot of messy issues with that. And hopefully we'll be able to discuss some of those as we go along, especially maybe from the audience itself. Moving along, we've got GraphQL, which, again, it's a slightly newer kid on the block. I think it's kind of the cool kid at this point. I think it is starting to seeing more adoption, especially with larger organizations coming to the fore. It is essentially a way to query the data that you need. That is kind of the whole purpose of why GraphQL existed. It enables omni-platform application development a lot easier way, as opposed to what REST does. And again, this all goes back to querying the information that you need for specific platforms, and it enables you to do that in a lot more efficient way. So that is one of the key benefits, one of the key superpowers of GraphQL. Then you've got the pros of it, which, again, it's quite flexible in terms, especially if you're a front-end developer, if you're a front-end engineer, it is a lot more flexible in terms of what you can request, what you can query, the information that you get back. It's predictable as well at the same time, because you've got, if you're requesting specific piece of information in a specific format with specific fields, you will get back exactly that information, as opposed to something that is a little bit more unpredictable. So flexible as well as a little bit more predictable. It's discoverable in nature, because by default, your schema, which is essentially a blueprint of your GraphQL API, is discoverable. It is essentially, I don't want to use the word documented, but it is available automatically without you having to do anything about it. The entire schema is typically available to you, and you can see the shape of it. You can see the different elements. You can see what all you have as part of your APIs. Now, should you stop there for your documentation? Absolutely not. I believe documentation doesn't stop at that automated documentation. I think that may be enough, maybe do the baseline stuff, but you have to go a little bit further to really make your developer experience up to the mark. I think there is need for proper documentation, not just relying on auto-generated documentation in most cases. So that's a separate topic, but out of the box, GraphQL provides you with these discoverability capabilities that could be quite beneficial. Some of the cons around this is, again, GraphQL being a relatively newer technology as compared to REST, the knowledge base around this is a little bit lesser at this stage. I think the kind of tools and resources around there that has come up leaps and bounds over the last few years. I think that has grown in a big way, but still not as mature, perhaps, as what REST is at this point. There are caching complexities, especially around the way GraphQL functions at this point of time. So you do need to be a little bit careful about that. And we could go into a discussion about what that means, especially when we talk about caching. And there are the kind of caching that we are talking about here, primarily around networks, because, again, GraphQL works primarily on using POST. And I think POST data can be, you typically cannot cache that. I think you're usually looking at get data, but there are ways around this as well. And then finally, we talk about security, because now you're relative to something like REST, where you're primarily looking at the HTTP endpoints, which you want to secure. Here, you're not just looking at that HTTP endpoint, not just looking at the URL for your GraphQL API. You're also looking at multiple levels, the data layer, the query layer that you need to secure as well. So there is an added requirement when it comes to your security needs. If you're trying to secure your GraphQL APIs, you need to consider the depths of your GraphQL queries and what you are permitting others to request off of your data graph. So that's where it's kind of the flip side of flexibility, where while you've got the flexibility of requesting any and all data, but if you're a backend engineer creating the data graph, you're primarily ending up with again, unpredictable request patterns. Essentially, you're not quite sure exactly what the structure of the request is going to be as a backend developer, and therefore it makes it a little bit less predictable. But there are mechanisms that you can impose, mechanisms that you can put in place that can address the security issues with GraphQL as well, and we'll see some of that as well. Then finally, we've got gRPC, which is probably the newest kid on the block at this point. It's a high-performance, open-source, universal RPC framework. Primarily, RPCs typically deal with actions. And I think that's where a great example here is an organization that uses RPC, I think at this point, I think it's Slack, if I'm not wrong. And they are really delving into the world of actions about, what you can do with messages. You're sending messages, you're receiving messages, what you can do with those messages as well. So it's a really action-oriented approach to that. It supports streaming, both unidirectional and bidirectional. So you've got streams of information coming in and going out or going out. You can very easily handle that and manage that with gRPC. Now, the pros over here is that because the way gRPC operates, it's in binary format. So the ultimate the API's translation, the message being moved from a client to server, or the requester to respondee, you're essentially doing that in binary format, and therefore it makes it very, very performant. It's also very, very lightweight. That also adds to the overall performance capability benefit that you get from here. It's great for server-to-server communication, which is the primary reason for gRPC's existence, I believe. Great for server-to-server communication. It is also language agnostic. The way you typically create your gRPC APIs, it's essentially you're starting off with your interface definition language. The common one is protocol buffers, and over there you're kind of providing a structure, kind of like a schema for the design of your API, which then needs to be built out both from your client side and your server side. And gRPC makes it very easy by helping you generate those stubs, which will again translate into your SDKs and libraries. So the cons over here is that obviously there is a translation that needs to happen beyond gRPC, where you need to, while you're designing your API with your IDC, which is protocol buffer, it needs to then translate it into a specific programming language to add the specific logic that you want for your APIs. And as long as the languages that you want to use are supported by the gRPC framework, that's fantastic. But if it isn't, then that can be quite challenging for you to handle and manage. It is also a little bit harder to discover and a little bit harder to document than the others, which again goes to why it is quite fine with server-server communication, but it's not really great for external APIs where you need that discovery mechanism, you need that documentation mechanism, which tends to not be there in this case. So it's also a framework that is built on your HTTP2. So if you're not using HTTP2, then it might be you may not be able to use gRPC in this case. So it makes use of the HTTP2 capabilities to enable streaming, to enable multiplexing, enable information transfer in a much more efficient and performant way. So that's typically just a quick introduction into the world of the three API styles. And of course, we can dive into the world of what are some of the factors that will enable you to choose one over the other, or maybe choose a combination of some of these to enable you to build the products that you want, your API first products or API-led products that you want to have. There could be a combination of these, or there could be one of these, but this is kind of a quick introduction into this. And I'm going to stop for now and see if there are comments or anything that folks want to share about what we have spoken about. So Rich, to get your initial impressions on this, any thoughts about the API styles that we just spoke about? Obviously, we've looked into some of these previously. At Tyk, we are supporting each one of these from an API management perspective. But any opening thoughts on this?
Well, I'd say let's throw it out to the floor. Let's maybe do a show of hands to see. Okay, first of all, who is familiar with REST? Who here has experience using REST? Does anyone want to give us any feedback or insights into their experiences and if they've tried any of the protocols?
Maybe we pick out a person, and if you're comfortable, perhaps unmute yourself and let us know if you would like to share your thoughts on this. I've got Christopher here who's raised his hand. Perfect timing. Christopher, what are your thoughts on the different API styles? We use them. What do you have to say about it?
Hi. Yeah, well, I've had a lot of experience with REST, but I think it's probably more, as you said, in the REST-ish category. So definitely not down the full hypermedia HATOS route that
right.
sort of REST is purists would go down. But it's been very effective. But I think the thing that has been the biggest bugbear there is the chattiness of the services. So that's where GraphQL is far more interesting and far more efficient. If you take looking at, I can't remember where I saw it. There was a study on, just energy compute requirements between sort of like complex REST service and something on GraphQL. You can save the planet by using GraphQL.
That is quite the tagline. I think I'm going to be changing that for the Hangouts in the future. Save the world, use GraphQL. That's fantastic. That's brilliant. Yeah. Okay. I hear you. Absolutely. I would agree with that completely. I think that was, like you said, it was one of the reasons why GraphQL came into existence as well, right? Because the use cases around that was to be able to reduce the number of round trips that you might have to make with REST, especially if you're trying to fetch information from multiple sources together. You might be able to do a much better job specifically with something like GraphQL. Chattiness, absolutely agree with you on that. Anything further on that in terms of, you've been quite experienced with this, any particular pitfalls that you've figured that, most people, like you said, REST-ish is kind of the norm as opposed to RESTful in most cases. What are some of the pitfalls maybe that you've come across that you get wrong almost immediately with REST?
I don't know if it was just REST, but I think I think API design is still the biggest issue. A number of experiences over the years with APIs exposed to lovely new digital services, and they're consuming these. The front ends are consuming these APIs. You think that's brilliant, and then you look at the actual utilization of those, and some of those APIs might be sending back 50 data items, but the front ends are only using 2. Again, from a, this comes down to like an efficiency point of view. The design of the API layer, the ability to compose it, is all sort of really, really critical, because you don't want to be sending large payloads of data where they only actually need a couple. And again, that's GraphQL sort of analyzes that. The biggest pitfall is that, which leads probably more into the gRPC side, is using REST to perform actions, to make procedural calls. And it just looks weird, when you're, the URLs and the things that just don't make sense. Because you're trying to sort of call a procedure and things like that. And one of the sort of questions I was thinking of is, I haven't done a lot with gRPC, and at the moment, where I see it and sort of understand it's used a lot more is in sort of system to system into microservice communication. It's a very, almost back end protocol, but I've had a number of people start talking about exposing gRPC APIs more widely. Now, is that an upcoming trend in your view, or?
I think there are a couple of points there, because I think it's a tricky situation to be in right now, because my personal view on that is that I'm not sure if gRPC was meant to do that yet, because right now there isn't the right browser support that you would need to, like I said, discover gRPC APIs very, very easily. You can use Open API specification to a certain point to document gRPC APIs as well. But I think beyond that, it's really, like I said, like you mentioned as well, it's really meant for that server-to-server communication where, you know, you're in that environment where you want really fast transaction. You know exactly, you know, where that information is going, what that network looks like. You're really looking at that, pounding out that performance really, really quickly, and getting that information up and down really, really efficiently. Exposing APIs externally, again, opens up a whole host of other challenges that will come with it. Again, when it comes to, I mean, the simplest one is going to be your security, where, you know, stream-based APIs and trying to secure those have slightly different challenges when it comes to something like your REST and GraphQL as well, because in streaming data here, your communication channel is a one-off. You're essentially establishing that communication, and then the data just can be, you know, can flow in and out seamlessly. That's the whole point of streaming, right? And which, again, from a security standpoint, how do you go about rate limiting something like that? How do you apply your quotas to that? How do you go about, you know, making the right authorization for some of those? Some of those challenges come up a lot more specifically, especially when you start thinking about externally exposing API. So I am not convinced gRPC as would be the go-to for people yet to you know, tackle external APIs. At least that's my opinion. I could be wrong. Maybe I could be talking completely different 6 to 9 months down the line, but that's kind of my opinion where I stand. I see it as a fantastic mechanism for you to have your server-to-server communication guaranteed in a performant and a lightweight manner. And then if you're looking to expose your APIs for external communication, use REST or GraphQL, depending on, you know, who or how you're going to be exposing that information. So that's the combination that I would typically recommend.
Cool. Thanks.
Great. All righty. Thank you so much, Christopher. That was great. Shall we move on? I've got Ikas here. I'm hoping I'm getting your name right. I apologize. I guess Preet Singh.
That's correct. Actually, I just wanted to share one more pointer. It happens mostly that we usually forget that point, but it's very, very common. And eventually, when a new story comes in for a backend API changing or updating, we developers tend to very reluctantly, we do not want to change the API endpoints and the insiders of the API or the API chunk code. And we tend to create a new API endpoint all the time, and it loads up as too many endpoints for a developer or for a front-end developer to actually gather it, the knowledge around it. But I think GraphQL, seemingly it's difficult to grasp at the first look, but since recently I've kind of dealt with GraphQL and felt that there's a problem solving where the REST leads to the multiple endpoints. So GraphQL actually solves your multiple endpoint problem, putting all the stuff in one API, and then you can request it as you go with it. So I think there's one critical problem which is solved, apart from various cons and pros of both the standards. But yeah, that's what I wanted to share.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. I think there is a big area where, I mean, if I really boil it down, I see GraphQL to have two key use cases. I think one major use case is what I think it was initially built for from Facebook, where you've got a data graph, you've got a data set that you want to expose, and it needs to be consumed across multiple platforms. So essentially, one data graph exposed across multiple platforms. That could be your web application, mobile application, your wearable tech. It could be your VR headsets or any of those devices, essentially an omni-channel, omni-platform distribution mechanism. And that's one of the key use cases of GraphQL, because you can request exactly what you want and it'll return exactly what you need. And on the other end, you've got these multiple data sources, which you may have as an organization. That is a very typical problem where you want to unsilo data from so many different data sources. You want to combine them, you want to make sense of them, you want to analyze them, and then hopefully expose them as well, whether that is for internal consumption or external consumption. You want to be able to unite that data, unify that data in a single data graph, perhaps, and do that in a very simplified manner, which would then be which will then be queried and build products on top of, perhaps. So absolutely right in terms of just the way it tackles, GraphQL as a technology tackles different data sources. When you're combining them, it is a really, really powerful thing. Now, I would challenge one thing though. I think the way in which you would achieve that with GraphQL, it is achievable with REST as well, I think, but it will all come down to the way you design your API. So if you have that interaction or combination that you need from your API, and you keep that in mind when you're designing your APIs, I think there is still merit for you to seek REST as a solution. Simply, again, depending on how deep you want to go into it. REST is in most cases capable of handling most of that GraphQL does, but I would side with you in saying GraphQL, better way of handling something where you have to make multiple HTTP round trips to request data and information between the client and the server. So absolutely with you on that bit. But I would say, and I think this is something that Christopher brought up initially as well, which was around API design. I think I've always maintained there is never going to be an alternative to bad API design. There is no silver bullet that is going to help you solve that. There's no paradigm that's going to help you solve that. So, if you design your APIs badly, regardless of gRPC, GraphQL, or REST, you're going to be in trouble. You need to address that in some way. So that is my 2 cents. I see, Christopher, you've got your hand raised. So rebuttal on that, perhaps, or something to add to that?
Just a quick comment, just to sort of reinforce what I was saying. That proliferation of APIs, because of the whole versioning, backward compatibility, you don't want to disrupt the status quo. I think that is absolutely critical, because I've recently talked to some people who are talking about, the platform's going to have over 1 million APIs, and it's like, really, 1 million? That's just absolutely crazy. And how much of that is duplicated, waste of effort, or just done because you don't want to break, you don't want to break things. And that's where I think that's another key advantage of GraphQL, I think, because you can easily do that without breaking clients. And I think that's a critical thing is, breaking clients is the bad side of APIs. So it's minimize that at all costs.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Correctly. It's a big problem in the fintech industry that you have to maintain multiple versions of your APIs, and then you have to serve them as much as their life shelf is. And that's the biggest trouble. And so maybe we as techies need to make aware the tech environment that it's the time to change the platform, to change the way we work around, and try to make our developers and their life as easy as possible by introducing something new which is more capable and which is taken to a long life shelf. And that's a big step.
And absolutely, I think GraphQL does have some of the benefits that it brings in, regards to just the versioning of things. If you really want to look at it, deprecation capabilities that brings in, which is obviously not an enforcer, but essentially a primer of what might be coming down the line. But I'm quite curious in terms of just handling with versions of APIs, which again comes up with conversation quite a lot, because people say versioning of GraphQL versus versioning of REST APIs. What is your take on something like that? Should you be versioning APIs? Should you be calling it a version 1, version 2? Should you be just calling it a different API altogether? How do you deal with it? What do you think about it? Christopher, Ekas, either one, or anybody else in the audience as well, feel free to jump in on that. Chris, any thoughts on that?
I think the main thing for me is it comes down to what the change is as to whether it's a new version or a new API, because the key thing is if it's within an organization and you're creating, you're managing the end consumer applications, mobile apps and stuff as well, it might not be so hard to drive that. But if you're in a distributed organization or you've got third parties creating that, you've got to be far more careful about breaking changes. So I think that's, if you're introducing a breaking change and you can't get those consumers, clients updated, you've got to either support multiple versions or call it a new API. At the end of the day, it's a separate API. So whether you call it a version or a thing is another matter. I think that's just from the versioning then gives you a a historical viewpoint. So it's like, this is an evolution, and eventually that old version will get deprecated. So if you start calling things new APIs all the time, you lose that thread. So that's more of them on the governance side rather than anything else. It's just making sure you're managing that, saying, right, we've had to release a new version because we needed to access these additional data sets that weren't exposed before. And again, GraphQL solves that nicely, because you can get new data without actually breaking the API. So I think it just, to me, it's the key aspect is breaking changes,
Absolutely.
New stuff.
But I think there's probably a work around that as well, where, I mean, I wouldn't say work around necessarily from a technical standpoint, but I think there's an important element that I think we need to consider anytime you're considering any kind of technology. I think because when you're considering a technology and a choice between whether that is a language or whether that is a framework or whether that is an API style, in this case that we are talking about, I think there are typically three elements to always consider. One is going to be, and these are based off of requirements, and hopefully they will help you make that choice a little bit. And there is always going to be that the business requirement that you want to look at, what is the problem that you're trying to solve and whether this is going to help me do that. There's a technical requirement in terms of the feasibility of it, whether what kind of infrastructure that you need, whether it's going to work or not work from a more technical standpoint. And then the final part is the human element of it, which is essentially obviously the knowledge base and the expertise that comes with it, but also there is a support and communication element to things. And I think versioning in a lot of cases, as is with documentation, a lot of times, I think, especially if you're thinking about a new version potentially coming out, a breaking change coming out, I think communication becomes so very important. And a lot of times people believe that while they might be looking at the technology aspect of things where, they might be breaking changes and let's talk about the version and get the right version out, get the right fields out. And there's a big element about communication that also needs to go with it. And it goes hand in hand with, anytime you're making a choice around it. So agree with you from a technology perspective. I think there is that element of the human element that also I think needs to be considered, and people sometimes overlook it. So hopefully that brings in that element as well. Ekos, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, just wanted to add, you were very, very correct that it's all about the communication you do it. And just continuing the part where Christopher left is similar. I would say that you really don't need to end up doing the breaking changes all the time, but it's all about, as you mentioned, the communication, how you do it. You still support all the aspects of the API which were previously there, and you could add new on the top of it. And eventually you tell your customers that this is not happening from this on date. Supposedly, like for an example, I will give you just like Angular 1 and Angular 2 came in. So Angular 2 gave it a drastic breaking down of the first one. And it was actually the history, and we still know it by saying that Google did it in a way. So you don't actually drastically give your customers a blow into the market, but take them slowly and make them provision to your changes so that they are aware of it, and eventually they tend to do that change and doesn't make you in the bad shape, doesn't lose your customer and users in that way, but it's a slight communication effect that you put in, you meld in, you wave in, and that's, I think, and eventually you save your time because you're not managing multiple API versions and you're not saving, or you're not dealing with a lot of code around. So I think slightly and melding in with your customers is the best approach for now, as we still are dealing with the techies or the tech stuff changing through the process. So that's what I think.
Don't remind me about the Angular 1 and 2 fiasco, because it was very interesting, because I literally started off with frameworks, and Angular was probably the first framework that I had really learned in terms of, just a single page application creation. And I was like confident and then ready. Okay, I've done my first proof of concept. I've done my first little project. And then suddenly the announcement comes that Angular 2 changes everything. While I think on my end, I think the changes that they made was for the best. I think that is my take on that. But the way they did it was horrible. Which actually made me switch to something like React. Like I think I was pretty all in on Angular initially, but then change framework. I've been pretty happy with React for the most part. It does the job really, really well, and it's a little bit more flexible than Angular, I found. So, but yeah, it was a bit of a nightmare. It could have been very easily avoided if they had walked the people who are early adopters, or even adopters who are going to be building products out of it in a much better way. So absolutely never disregard the human element of things. Rich, in terms of your experience as well, just dealing with some of these, the communication, the human aspect of it, the communication aspect of technology as well, any sort of insights that you've seen from your work as a researcher?
So I was at a conference a few years back, and there was a chap speaking from YouTube, like a product manager, and I think it was when they were introducing some quite significant changes to like their business accounts around all the tooling that would enable you to sort of track and monitor your video content. And his sort of key insight was, well, on this topic, was exactly what you described, Budha, the importance of making sure that if you are going to make like a breaking change, or if you're going to make a major change to the functionality or the proposition of the product that you're delivering, then you have to sort of be confident that the additional value that somebody gets as a result of having to relearn or learn something new justifies the time and effort that it's going to take for them to go through that or learn the new thing. A very hard thing to quantify, obviously. I think from my perspective, obviously anything you can do to get customer insight feedback into, okay, if we're going to change this thing, how much of an impact is it going to have? Often that can be hard to quantify, again, if you've got customers maybe who have got very specific edge cases. But if you can get some confidence into, okay, what are the majority of our customers using our product for? What is the impact that making a breaking change would cause? And then having to migrate them onto a new API or a new platform, new framework, then all of those decisions need to be sort of factored into that upgrade or that update. Absolutely.
I totally agree with that. So absolutely, human element, very, very important. Definitely don't forget about that. Thank you so much. I think this has been really, really good conversation. I'm going to move down the list a little bit and see if there is, any other opinions and thoughts around what we are talking about today, the great API debate as it is with REST, GraphQL, and gRPC. I see Carlos in the group in attendance. Carlos, anything to share with us? If you're comfortable, perhaps try and unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about your experience with it. Or if not, there you go. Hey, Carlos, welcome to the GraphQL Hangout. We are not able to hear you. Unmuted. Yes, but I think you're very, very silent.
I don't have any points to point here. Thanks.
Okay, got it. No worries. Not a problem. I just about heard you there. No worries. Absolutely okay. Anybody else?
What about on this topic of updating APIs and versioning APIs? Has anybody got any experience trying that in GraphQL? Or like, I know, Chris, you mentioned that, okay, there is an improvement there. Care to maybe share your insights, or anybody else, any experience in how GraphQL actually improves that? From my understanding, it's something that can be a bit more automated based on your sort of schema definition and how that gets versioned, that the underlying schema definition gets versioned rather than the API itself. Does anybody else have any insights on that, or Budha, care to share how maybe GraphQL does that a bit differently?
I think the key thing there, I'm just going to see if anybody's raising their hands or not. I think Ekas or Chris or anyone in the team, if you want to jump in at any point, just feel free to do so. I think some of the versioning aspect of it is really the fact that, again, the addition of fields potentially is a little bit more seamless when it comes to your GraphQL APIs. The way you might communicate the deprecation of fields, that also is a little bit more easier to implement, simply because, again, out of the box, you've got directives that enable you to communicate that in a lot easier way as opposed to something like REST. So there are mechanisms that are in place that makes it makes it easier. Now, how you end up using it is really up to you. The way you would, again, add to that communication, just like documentation, because there are automated stuff that comes with GraphQL, right? You've got your documentation that's automated as well. Is it enough? Probably not. Same goes with your deprecation capability. Good starting point. Is it enough? Probably not. So I think there are mechanisms in place. The way you use it and enhance it and build on top of it, I think, will be very, very important for you to really make the most of it. And if you really want to be successful, you need to probably, once again, add that little human communication element on top of that technology to make it a little bit easier. Chris, I see you unmuted. Any thoughts on that?
I think the biggest challenge I've seen with like the REST, I've not done a lot of graph stuff, just looked into it, but the biggest challenge was adding data items. So you never know what you need until you need it. So obviously adding data items to a REST API is a lot more complex, a lot more impacts right the way through the stack. So at the end of the day, all we're doing is shifting data around, taking data from one point and sticking it somewhere else. So the biggest advantage I see with GraphQL, apart from the less chattiness, is the fact that you can enhance that schema without affecting existing clients. They don't have to do anything differently. Their queries will still work. They'll get the data. But as you say, if you can communicate and broaden that, you say, right, you can now get this additional data. This is now available. Deprecating is a different kettle of fish, because obviously for some clients, that's a potentially a breaking change to how they use that data, display it or whatever. But it's the biggest challenge I've tended to see was that enhancing, as things go on, you want to add more, you want to make it more robust, more feature rich, and that tends to be adding data. So the challenge around that in REST is, you're getting that whole sort of versioning debate or new APIs or different ways of doing that. But in Graph, you've got a much simpler road to get additional data to the clients.
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to, once again, with REST, you've got that thing of payloads, right? And I think if you're once again adding a field which is then made available for that API endpoint all throughout, every single client that is going to be making that API call is going to get that information whether they need it or not. Whereas with GraphQL, that's not really the case, where you can still continue requesting exactly the information that you needed. You're not really adding to your payload simply because the backend engineer or somebody else needed that information for their particular use case. So absolutely, I think there is that flexibility element that definitely comes in. One question that I'm quite curious about, and again, it comes up quite frequently, almost as a con for GraphQL, and I think to a certain degree gRPC as well, is the observability element of it. The way you might end up tracing your APIs, whereby REST seems to be a little bit more straightforward in the way you might be observing your APIs, analyzing them, monitoring them, as compared to, say, GraphQL, especially in an environment where you've got multiple different data sources that are probably contributing, or multiple microservices even contributing towards a specific response to your query. So, any particular insights on that element as well, around the API observability of REST versus, say, the other API styles? Chris, Eckers, anybody else in the group? Or Rich, in our case as well, just thinking about it from a more telemetric side of things. I think we are starting to look into open telemetry a little bit more, and how distributed tracing can help us solve some of these challenges. But any particular thoughts around some of that particular challenge that keeps coming up with GraphQL as a technology, where there just aren't as many in-depth monitoring tools that are capable of going into the complexities of the API queries that you might be making across the board?
Yeah, it's not something I've looked at in detail, but I think this is, if you're getting into enterprise observability, it all depends on what you're trying to do. Obviously, open telemetry, open tracing, support for those will enhance that sort of end-to-end capability, and that tends to be a key sort of driver. You want to what happens to a call from the front to the back. Then if you've got a complex microservice architecture sitting behind your GraphQL service, understanding what that one API call does to your environment could be quite critical, especially at peaks, at critical times, that sort of thing. So I think it's supporting those open standards, so that the tooling can easily be adapted to do that, whether you've got sort of large enterprise level observability tools, or you're relying on other tooling like Elk or other capabilities to get your observability.
Absolutely. Completely agree with that. And I think there is also that room for standardization as well, right? Because when you get to the point of standardization and specific standard practices that you would have, or even specifications that govern exactly what to expect with some of the technologies that are being utilized, it makes it a lot easier for you to integrate with external systems as well. And I think that's where something like an open API specification for REST, and even extending that over to gRPC makes life a lot easier, because you've got a standard industry-wide, almost accepted specification that as long as you're following that particular practice, that you're going to get the right information out of that, whether that is analytics or monitoring or basic documentation using Swagger. You get all of that pretty much right there. Now the debate there again is whether GraphQL needs a version of an open API specification, or GraphQL is sufficient. Perhaps something that needs to be built on top of that is probably a debate for another day. But I'm, again, a big fan of standardization. And one of the reasons for that is, again, just the ease with which you can integrate with tools, because it's a lot more predictable in the way it behaves, makes it really, really lucrative, I think. So yeah, absolutely on that. One other element, I think I'm just going back to my point around just the human element of it. And I think one thing that I found, and I think we were running a similar one last week on this as well, and one of the key things that kept coming up while doing some of the research was pitting one technology against the other, as if it's very much a zero-sum game, and it's always a versus. And I think the topics around REST, GraphQL is the new REST, and I think I was just looking at the state of GraphQL report, and I think there is still a question that keeps talking about, will GraphQL ever replace REST? And to me, question like that always seems like it's missing the point of its existence. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. There are use cases where it solves a problem, and I think that's the whole reason for its existence. There are particular use cases where you would be using one over the other, or maybe a combination of both. But sometimes I think either articles or things that you read, or experts, maybe based off of their opinion and experience, and by no means do I want to discount any of that, I think they sometimes end up doing a little bit of a disservice to the technology, because either they put something on an absolute pedestal, or pretty much bring some technology down completely, whereby that's probably not as warranted. In most cases, not a binary yes or no here, where you pick one, and therefore, because you've picked one, you can no longer be faithful to the other technology. That's really not the case. I personally believe in a harmonious existence in all of these technologies. There is definitely room for us to have inter-service communication with something like gRPC, when exposing that information. Because it's just, when it comes to inter-service communication, I think if you were to put something like REST or something like GraphQL, the performance will take a hit, because there is a degree of facade that comes on top of it, which is just not as binary as what you would get with gRPC. The whole reason for its existence is performance, and making sure that your payloads are being transferred in a low latency, high performance way. That's the entire reason why gRPC in a big way came into existence. Of course, it's also a way for you to handle actions, but this was kind of the big reason for it. So use it for that use case. And similarly, for external consumption, you've got REST, you've got GraphQL. In most cases, I still feel, I think REST does the job under most of your use cases. It will meet that requirement. And that again goes back to, your knowledge base, the amount of resources you want to put in. If you have been using REST, do you really need to switch to GraphQL, and what the cost of that is going to be from both a resource perspective as well as a time perspective? And And similarly, if the choice is yes, absolutely, I think we see a long-term benefit of using GraphQL, then by all means do that. And sometimes I think use cases can also be, not use case, sorry, case studies can also be a little bit deceptive, where you look at GraphQL and look at, the Netflixes and the GitHubs of the world, which is great. I think it's great to aspire to that. But in most cases, when you're starting off, that is not where you're starting off. You're not going to be dealing with maybe 100,000 APIs, perhaps on day one, most likely. If you are, then okay, well done. I think you need to look at your technology stack really,
really a million APIs. We were
and a million APIs, exactly. But a lot of times, I think we end up comparing ourselves with organizations that are probably a little bit further ahead in their journey, and I think they've gone through a bit of a transition. So you can future-proof yourself today if you are willing to take up that burden of upfront need to invest this much resource to maybe one day utilize the full potential of it, or you get up and running quickly today and then iterate on that process. So to me, it's always going to be about know what your requirement is and then test it out for yourself. Try out gRPC, try out GraphQL, maybe a very, very simple project for you, and see where you land. What do you think? Is it easy to get started? Is it hard to get started? Is it something that, tools and support is easily available or not? I think the communities around GraphQL specifically has grown significantly. The kind of responses that you get to your questions has improved, but REST is always going to have a lot more support because it's just been there for longer. So there is always going to be a little bit more that you might need to research and do on your own before you get that level of support. But is it enough? It might be enough for your use case. So try it out for yourself. Don't be entirely swayed by what is out there, or maybe even entirely swayed by what I'm saying right now. Try it out for yourself. Come back and maybe share your experience with some of these technologies and tell us what you think about it. Always consider business requirement, technology requirement, and the human requirements around each one of them, and see where you land with GraphQL, REST, gRPC.
Do we have any resources on, like, I guess, use cases that would best fit the different protocols? Do we have any sort of content or guide that we
I think we've got a couple around GraphQL. We've definitely got a lot around REST for sure. We've got like case studies where organizations are using them. gRPC is an interesting one because I think for its streaming capabilities can sometimes be very interesting and exciting for folks. One of the use cases that I've seen it being used is essentially under e-commerce organization in some cases, where you're really looking at inventory management as an example, where if you have like a huge list of items that you're looking to add to your database, you can add that as I think it's probably a client-side streaming, where you've got a stream of data that is coming in, it's been pushed into your database, and you get an acknowledgement back saying, yeah, it's all okay. So instead of having to, add in each one at a time, or having to make multiple round trips, or having an API specifically built to have bulk data, you can very easily make use of the streaming capabilities of gRPC, and you can make that happen very, very simply. So gRPC probably a little lesser known. I think the organization that I've seen, I'm not sure exactly if they're using gRPC at this point of time, but they're definitely using RPC at this point, which is Slack, I think. And once again, when you think RPC or gRPC, you think actions. When you think about REST, you think resources. When you think about GraphQL, you think about querying data in an efficient manner. So that's kind of the three ways in which you could potentially think about the different API styles. Nice. Cool. All right. Any parting words here? I think we don't have a clear winner, but if I have to put a vote, I think the winner of the last discussion that we had last week was pretty much REST, actually, simply because it's just flexible enough under most use cases and circumstances. I think anything that GraphQL can do, you can get REST to do the same. It's easier to get started with. I don't want to declare it as the winner, but I think resoundingly, its capabilities sort of put it a little bit ahead of some of the others. Yet I see Christopher probably disagrees completely with me, so he's got his hand up there. So Chris, go ahead.
I think I would agree with one of your previous statements, which I would summarize as the right tool for the right job.
Yeah.
And I think you summarized it very nicely. They each have capabilities to work in a space very well. It's not either or, it's generally where do you need to use them? So if you've got a heavy variable query service that, you know, you don't want to restrict things, then, you know, GraphQL is absolutely ideal for that. If you've got a pretty static service that, you know, it's going to be the same payloads every time, or you want to take updates and things like that, then REST fits that much, much better. So I think, you know, you've got to use the right tool for the right job. I think that's the design element we talked about earlier. You know, I know for developers it's a scary word, but, you know, a little bit of design governance and things like that goes a long way in making sure that you're doing the right thing for the future.
Absolutely. I'm a huge proponent of governance, by the way. So, you know, I'm always going to be on that camp. So I'm always a big fan of getting that right, standards and mechanisms in place, because to me, innovation is built on standardization. That is my perspective on this all the time. You need, if you're looking at a building that is an innovative thing that you're building, you need to have your foundations that are strong and reliable. And I think that's the only way to do that is through standardization of your practices. You cannot have unpredictability underneath while you're trying to also build a building. You're going to fall, you're going to break, you're going to die. It's not going to end up very, very well. So, you know, that's my take on that. So thank you so much, Chris, on that. Ekas, parting words from you? Do you have a clear winner that you want to declare, or are you going down the right tool for the right job route as well?
Right, though it's a deep explanation to it, because I recently completed my thesis, and for my thesis I took the both comparisons of complete entire enterprise software development. But I eventually was in a fight with me that I want to learn GraphQL. So for that reason, I chose a comparison between REST and GraphQL. And I ended up doing that. But eventually, I may be wrong at the choice of framework. But for my use case, I chose Nest.js with GraphQL, with REST API, Prisma, Apollo. And seems like a lot of tech jargon, a lot of tech tools. But my vote still goes to GraphQL because it was more of a convenience for me when it comes to querying the stuff compared to REST. But in terms of configuration, it was a very hard, and even SJS team itself say that it's not for beginners. The framework is not for beginners, because the entire framework was new for me because I'm coming from Node Express. So eventually it was a too much task for me, but I melded down to low level, I would say, chunks in a way. And I end up creating both parallel APIs, comparing REST and GraphQL together on a similar platform, similar configurations, and within the similar framework. Within one microservice, I was hosting both REST and GraphQL together. So it was kind of a new invention in a way that I tried out. But yeah, I still vote for GraphQL for what it gives me convenience at the end of the day. Yeah.
Fantastic. That is amazing. This is the GraphQL Hangout. I think GraphQL had to have at least one vote on in its favor. So I'm really, really happy you said it. So well done. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That's brilliant. And I think I would love to read your thesis as well. I mean, if it's already ready, perhaps you could share the link with us if it's available, or whenever it's available in the future, do let us know. I think we would love to have a deep dive into that as well, because it sounds really, really interesting what you're working on. Awesome. All right, then. That is kind of the big thing. That's all we've got for today, I think. Richard, any parting words from you today, or I think we leave it at GraphQL as the winner from Ekas. Okay, cool. So that's about it, folks. I think for us, obviously from our end, from a Tyk and API management perspective, I think we've worked with all three of them and we support all three of them. If you're looking at security, if you're looking at any of those elements of API management, we've looked at some of these issues and areas, and I think that's where some of our opinions are coming from, having worked in the industry a little bit. But by all means, I think whoever is watching, even after this event is done, please do feel free to share your thoughts, your opinions. We would love to know a little bit more about it. This has been the great API debate about REST, GraphQL, and gRPC. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you, Chris and Ekas. This has been fantastic chatting with you and getting to know a little bit about your thoughts and opinions on this matter. Thank you so much, Richard, as well, for co-hosting this session with me. It's always fantastic to have you with me. So with that, thanks, everyone. This has been fantastic. Until next time, take care and see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.